Recording now. Okay, hello everyone. Once again, welcome to Accessible Digital Mapping provided by the Maryland Department of Disabilities, the IT Accessibility Initiative. Usual housekeeping items for today's presentation. We do have captioning available. You can turn that on by pressing the Show Captions button on your menu ribbon in your main region. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel, hopefully within the week. We will also share the slide deck at that time. We do have a couple demos today using some of the maps. One is just Google Maps, and then the other is Esri's demonstration of accessibility practices. That link is in this, so you should have everything you need. If for whatever reason you don't receive it or you did not receive, you don't get to the recording, you can contact us at mdod.nva@maryland.gov. I would ask that people hold questions until the end because I can't really see chat while I'm doing this. So I will check that at the end, but please put your questions either in chat or in Q&A, and I will try to address them at the end. With that, let us go ahead and get started. So first, I just want to cover the basics of web accessibility because this comes up with maps as well. These are the things that you're going to hear about in any presentation on accessibility ever. So first is alt text, so providing a description of non-text content, mostly images, but this can apply to things like charts or figures or buttons, anything like that. Excuse me, sorry. The second is keyboard access, being able to control elements and interact with them using just the keyboard. A lot of assistive technology relies on this as well. So things like screen readers or voice controls, they operate in the same way where they are essentially telling the computer, do what would happen if I had pressed enter. So in this case, we need to make sure all of our elements like buttons, search fields, links work with tab, the arrow keys, enter key, spacebar, all of those, making sure that users can get to everything and they can do so efficiently, that they don't have to tab through 16 links in order to get to the one button that they want. And then headings and navigation is another critical part of this, is being able to identify content and have it kind of sorted out in a logical format, but then B, also using those programmatically to jump around. Screen readers, voice control software, a lot of these types of assistive technologies, or AT, use headings as an easy way to move between sections quickly. So a screen reader can press H in order to move through all the headings, skipping all the other content in between in order to find that section they want. Reading order is especially important, especially when we start talking about some of the more complex map applications out there online, like Google Maps or uh, the Esri platform or any of those other kind of presentations of data, because the reading order is what's going to help us, A, maintain those relationships, but then B, kind of the expected behavior when you put in something such as a search. When you enter your search, you kind of assume that you're going to move down to, the results or a directions list or something like that. I shouldn't have to scroll through other buttons to get to that list. So what are those kind of assumed pathways that a user is going to move through, and does it actually follow those, or does it go somewhere else? And that's going to confuse our user. Next is field labels. So making sure all of our edit fields or any other interactive button like that has a proper label and that is communicated to users. Usually that's done through, there's a variety of ways to do it, but it's usually done with label. In this case on screen, there's an example of HTML. This was actually pulled from a map. And right now there's a button that's highlighted there. The key thing here is that there is an aria-label attribute, and that says and has a value of tables. So that means when a screen reader finds this button, it's going to say tables button. So the user understands what this button's going to do. So those are very important. There's other ways to do it. Like if you look up further in, its parent has label equal tables. It's kind of the same thing. It's a bit different because that's not HTML. That's this calcite XML version. So that might not communicate. So that's why we make sure we have multiple ways. So there's, a backup. And then finally, link descriptions, making sure users understand what happens when they click a link. Are they going to another website? Are they going to change the data in here? Or are they going to open sub results of a section, that kind of thing. So making sure users understand, what does this link contain? What is its content? Where is it going to send me? What is its behavior? So all of these are are obviously important. They apply to pretty much anything in accessibility, where we're talking about websites, applications, software. But today we're going to focus on their content inside mapping applications. And this is a big challenge because maps are primarily, they're intended for visual consumption. So how do we communicate something either non-visually or to someone who has maybe color blindness and isn't able to tell differences between sections, or if someone can see the map, but they need to go in and put in directions, and they either maybe they broke their wrist and they can't use their mouse hand, or maybe they have Parkinson's and they're too shaky in order to control the mouse correctly, so they need to use the keyboard, or someone who's using voice commands in order to enter it. And they're telling their computer, click region A where, search Google Maps is or something, and making sure that, Google Maps picks that up. So those are the kinds of things we need to consider today. We'll also talk a little bit about some alternatives, because in some cases we need to just offer additional options to users, because there is only so much we can do due to the complexity of this and the challenges involved. And then finally, what research is being done out there in order to make more accessible applications. So first, here are your general rules of thumb when you're creating a map. Think about these when you're deciding, I want to put a map on our website in order to do this. First, what are you trying to convey? What is the purpose of it? Is it something to show data? In that case, would a table be better because a table is easier to make accessible? Is it to provide directions? Well, what if someone can't use that map or can't zoom in on it or something? Is there another way I can list this out? Can I give people options? Do I need to absolutely use a map? Is it the best way to do it? In which case, do I need to offer an alternative? That kind of thing. Second, you want to keep it simple. Remove extraneous info. Really make sure that the purpose of that map is dialed in. If it's for directions, it really should just show that and detail the route. We shouldn't have to get, you know, height information, or, heat index, or, any other kind of information other than streets and directions. If you're doing data, make sure that you're keeping it kind of compact and only showing a couple points, or, values of different types, or that you have a way for people to select which ones to show so they're not getting either overstimulated or they're having trouble comprehending, 6 different data points that are all really close to each other, that kind of thing. Next would be checking color contrast for text and symbols primarily. Maps are again very complex visually, but really what we want to make sure is that people are able to read where like those names are, like in the Google Maps thing, Baltimore, very clear, very prominent, but all the smaller uh, you know, suburbs or, neighborhoods inside Baltimore might be harder to read it, because they're either, a lighter gray, or they're against a background, or there's a bunch of, roads and, other symbols around them, that kind of thing. So making sure that they're very clear, easy to read. There is, if you see there is the 4.5 to 1 ratio. That is the standard ratio, or the minimum contrast ratio needed, according to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Talked about those in other webinars. For more information, please refer to our YouTube channel, or, refer to our webpage, what have you. Um, Now, the uh, hold on. Okay. Um, Now, again, that is the minimum ratio. Obviously, there can be more and such, and it can be also a little dependent on what your base map is. So that'll be something we talk about shortly. One other thing to talk about here is the visual focus indicator. This is an outline that kind of moves around with elements. It's really important for keyboard users because it tells them where they are on screen. I'll demonstrate it later, but essentially it's a way for a person to tell, I'm a, I'm currently looking at this link. If I press enter, it's going to open that link. So in other cases, and depending on your map or the parts of your uh, system, like if you're using Esri, you might need to be wary of the color contrast of that because, on your main menus, it might look fine, but if you have buttons on top of your map or like, the little flags that you can click for more data, if the outline isn't really visible on those, but there is one, that doesn't help a user. So we need to maybe change it when it's in that scenario. So it is something to kind of keep in mind. It's not just you can set it out an outline for anything and have it go. You might need to adjust it based on what your map application is and what it's doing. The next point is you want to use real text when possible. So real text is meaning actual text, not images of text. So when you enter it into, to the program, into the code, it's actual text. And that usually allows users to use either custom style sheets or for screen readers or other AT to actually access it and be able to read it. That gives us a lot more flexibility, and it means we don't have to try and write descriptions of every single part. So, if possible, when you're creating buttons or links or other such details, when you click that flag, that tooltip pops up. If that can be text, it's more likely to be accessible than if you posted an image there, or if you just have your logo or something, or if you posted um, all your data points are just a symbol, and then we have to write a description for each of those, that kind of thing. And then finally, check your tab order. This is that reading order and that keyboard access of making sure that things move in a way that you kind of expect it to behave. Can you reach every button without the mouse? Great. But if I press zoom in and then, I, you know, tab next and there's no zoom out button, I'm going to be a little confused. Or if in the case of like the search results, I see this fairly common. It's not before where there'd be a search bar and then there'd be like a home button and then like a list options button or something. I'll type in something in search, but then when I press tab, instead of going to the results, it goes over to the home button. And then I press tab again, it goes to the list, and then it finally goes to the results. And so that means I now have something kind of in my way. So making sure that your order makes sense to people, in some cases you might have to force it to move on interaction so that a user moves to what they want to deal with. So color contrast is, again, something that can be challenging with maps. One of the nice things about a lot of the tools out there, I'm mostly talking about Esri in general because that is one of the most prominent tools out there, and it is one that is very commonly used in the state. But there are other ones out there that do similar things where they have a standard map, and that's, in this case, what we're going to call low contrast. So this map gives us quite a bit of information just looking at it. We have, these locations, Caracas Bays, Wellington, Mount Victoria. We see, this Route 1 kind of crossing through the whole city here. And then we also have some topographic information. If you look in and look closely, you can see there's some shadow effects and details dictating kind of like these are mountains or, hills or, this is some form of height. Um, but all of the street areas and the streets themselves are really hard to distinguish because all the buildings are kind of a very light gray, and all of the roads, especially the non-highways, are just white. So, I would have to zoom in to really tell more details. For someone who might have color blindness or has another condition affecting, like they need magnification or something, it's going to be even more difficult to tell details because that whole area, like around Massey University, Wellington, like I can kind of distinguish, okay, there's a few city blocks and here's these street areas, but to someone else, that might look as just like one solid piece, and that gives them no information. And that's why having the option of turning on a high contrast base map that Esri provides helps a lot because now all of our streets are outlined in red, and our routes on in the bay up there at the north part are much more defined. Like I could barely see them in the original base map. In the high contrast base map, they really stick out. Now you do lose some information. I lose, you know, the height differences and the shadow effects, and um, in some cases, there's some other details that are missing. However, if I'm just looking for directions, this makes it a lot easier for me to tell, here's where the parks are, here's where streets are, here's where, the smaller streets around Mount Victoria. There's that big kind of center circle just east of Massey University. Those kinds of things are easier to determine. So if the purpose of this map is to give directions or to show kind of the layout of the city, having the option of the high contrast is better. Now, the caveat is if my map is actually supposed to show topographic information like, the heights of the mountains in Caraca Bay, well, okay, then the high contrast doesn't help me. So then there might need to be another option instead. And that's where the caveat of what can be made accessible needs to be more nuanced, that approach, because we need to make sure the map is showing what it's supposed to. So things like heat indexes or topographic information, that kind of thing, there is kind of more of a play of if we can use something else to explain this information to users, we should. We can use, again, other indexes, we can use tables, we can use lists, um, but the ways those maps are defined, have been defined for a long time is with those particular methods. So we can't really alter those without changing how that information is conveyed. So that's where later on we'll talk about like, well, what can we do instead? Or what else can we offer users to maybe add options to make it easier for them to get that information without changing the entire purpose of the map. Now, simplicity and function is a really important thing because A, this makes your job easier of making sure your material is coming out accessibly. B, it helps all of our users, mostly with comprehension, but then also with navigation and control. Um, and then finally, it means that we can offer additional options rather than trying to stuff as much in as we can. So first off, we want to use an accessible base map. We were just talking about that. In some cases, like the one on screen here, this one is a map, I think it was about um, it was some kind of like location of certain kinds of centers that's licensing centers or something. I don't quite remember anymore. However, it's all one type of information. Um, but because, really what we're trying to tell you is location of something, I don't need to give you any other details. So the base map can just be this blank gray slate because really what I'm trying to show you is most of these are concentrated in these areas, that kind of thing, or here's a few out in Salisbury or Cumberland that are still available. But between Cumberland and Hagerstown, there isn't one of these locations. You do want to avoid stylizing text because the more you mess with that, the harder it is for users and the harder it is for you to make that contrast compliance issue there. So if you notice, Frederick is kind of buried under those blue dots. So is Columbia and part of Germantown. So in those cases, we have a little bit of an issue here, and that might be something we would want to correct in this map of can we put something either outline Frederick and Germantown or outline the text with, an outline to help it stand out more. But we don't want to do more than that because then we're starting to have to change A, more things, B, make it harder for other uses. We can't pull this and put in some other type of data without having to potentially mess with it again. So the more you mess with things, obviously, the harder it is going to be. Third, you want to limit your use of patterns. Um, Now, this doesn't mean don't use patterns. Patterns are great because one of our issues is if you only use color, then what does someone who's colorblind do to understand what you're trying to convey? But you don't want to use more than a few patterns because if you use, more than five or six, and especially if you have like kind of overlaps, like you're talking about, let's say, Baltimore, and you're talking about, uh, population density or something, or against, you know, age groups. And now you're going to have an overlap of styles in that area. And if you try and do like three, four more in that spot, it just becomes a mess and no one can understand it. So always try to kind of limit how many you use. General recommendation is six to seven at most. Any more than that, it becomes a problem. I kind of was already talking about this, but try to avoid stacking textures as much as possible. Again, because that just makes things conflicting and confusing. And the more you stack, the harder it is to differentiate between types. One of the best ways to kind of deal with this, honestly, and a lot of these tools offer, is the ability to filter. Enable the functionality of click that checkbox and it shows this detail. Um, so that way a user, if for whatever reason they want to try and see all of them, they can, turn them all on, and then they can kind of pare down and try and figure out what they need, or, flip one on, flip one off in order to be able to see those things. But, you know, the the more you add, the harder it is to convey. Sorry, I feel like I'm rambling a little bit. Uh, Again, if you have questions, I'll try to address them at the end. Now, navigation. This is very important, especially with these online applications, because uh, getting around these can be a bit of a challenge, especially for AT users. So we want to make it as easy as possible and efficient. A lot of the times people think keyboard access is just, oh, I can move around everything with the keyboard. And while that's a big part of it, the other part is it shouldn't take them 10 minutes to do something that really should only take two. So in order to get around that, we need to make sure we give them the tools to do so. Headings, landmarks, and shortcuts are a great way to do this. Headings and landmarks give not just a visual way of distinguishing, here's your search results, or here is this location and this on the map, but they give us a programmatic way for AT to jump to that section, so they don't have to scroll through all the menu options to get there. Same with landmarks. Shortcuts, in some cases, that's either links to certain areas, or if you have the option, you can program in totally new ones. Esri, a lot of these more complex tools have those options available. Google has built-in shortcuts that you can use, anyone can use. Uh, they Some of them are on by default, others might be tied to your Google account, but you can use a lot of them without any issue. And they make things a lot easier and more efficient for users. If you do shortcuts, add those in, make sure to communicate to your users. Otherwise, they're going to be confused when they, press Control Alt J and it jumps to something else and they're like, wait, what? What just happened? Um, Regarding that, and then reading order, once again, that logical flow of I should move from the control to the search to the results. I shouldn't go through other buttons or anything to get to those. In some cases, you need to enforce that because if you're using one of these more complex systems, um, they might not have the built-in native functionality that HTML has. In the example I was showing you before, there was using what was called Calcite, I think, and that language. They needed to add additional attributes, the ARIA, in order to A, enforce keyboard usage, and then B, to also communicate that to users. So be aware of that, is that in some cases you're going to be using other attributes in order to do this. It might not be built in depending on what you're using. This especially comes up when you're moving like focus around and such. So, when you have a dialog pop up or tooltips pop up, when I press that flag on, a location in the map, it opens up a tooltip. And then I want to read that tooltip, but when I close it, I want to go back to where I was. I shouldn't jump all the way back to the start and have to move through everything again. So all of that kind of thing is the things we need to enforce. If we can, it's best to skip unnecessary elements. This comes up a lot with base maps, honestly, because in some cases the map application will be kind of separated into quadrants because it's loading in new parts and such, and screen reader might get to them, and that's not going to give us any information in some cases unless we can use it to control the map somehow. Um, They've been getting better about this. I haven't seen one, at least in recent months, that's done this, but it is something to be aware of is if there's something that's kind of just a background control or background element, give people a way to get around it. Um, in some cases, this can be more drastic. We'll talk about that later, where we're saying skip to data table, and that way they can just jump immediately past the entire map. But this might come up with other kinds where you want someone to be able to just jump to the legend or jump to the search results without looking at the map first. And then finally, providing labels and accessible tooltips. We need to make sure that those tooltips that contain the information about that location that they're trying to get to is actually readable. If it just pops up and I can see it, but a screen reader doesn't pick it up, well, then it's not helpful. Or if it's like, click here for their website or something, but I can't get to it pressing tab or arrow keys and then enter, then I can't get to that website and I have to go enter it manually, and now I'm annoyed. So, we want to make sure that we're telling people, we're giving people ways to get to these things and able to read it. We also need to know the functions of these buttons because if the zoom in or zoom out button isn't labeled, just says zoom, I don't know which direction it's going. And then I'm pressing it and suddenly I've zoomed in, 500%. And I'm like, I didn't want to be here at all. And I don't know where I am anymore. I just closed out the map and I left. And I went to something else to try and find my information. So making sure people understand what is the functionality. This is especially important if your map is doing something like showing all the locations of your offices for your agency, and you have multiple locations listed, and then you have, separate websites or separate contact information. If they have buttons for those, press this to go to their website or press this to register or make an appointment, that kind of thing. Making sure that they know appointment at this office is really necessary for that user experience. Now, let's discuss some alternatives because there are times when we should use a map because it is the best way to communicate this data, but it's not the most accessible, and we want to make sure that A, we're giving people options, and then B, in some cases, there's only so much we can do because we're working with what tools we have, we're working with, a very complex set, and we need to make sure that we're making what accommodations we can. So the two best options for showing this, especially when we're talking about data, is lists and tables. Lists are nice, especially if you're dealing with a lot of like, here's our locations, here's websites, here's, service locations and their addresses. And those are very simple. They're easy to add, easy to format. Usually they come out with just a heading and the list out, or if like a search result shows all of them on the left there, a user can just scroll through them and click the one they want. So lists are a very simple way and great for kind of, contained information like that. If you're working with more like data, like you're talking about, topographic information or heat index, I keep using those for like, age versus population density, that kind of thing. um, Tables is going to be probably your better method then because you're having separate data points for separate demographics or columns, and tables are able to be coded to have maintain those relationships for us. Usually they can have filters attached to them, sort by ascending or descending in that column, but we need to make sure that we include heading rows so that in some cases if you need to, a first column, so that if I'm in, like, the example on screen is just a very simple table I threw together here. Your top row is building, street, city, state, zip code. If I go down to the final entry under zip code, if I was using a screen reader, it would read 21801, then zip code for the column, and then state park for the row. So it communicates the headings to the user because it's formatted and programmed correctly. Without that, a user would have to go to 21801 and then have to make sure that they remembered, am I in the right column? They might go back up and check, come back down, go to the left, make sure they're in the right row. They have to do all of that manually and in their head. Whereas if we set this up correctly, it will do that for them, make the user experience better, and they're able to get around and hear all this information and make more sense of it rather than having to parse out where things are and then do a lot of extra work on their end. I do want to mention at some point, we do need to expect a certain level of competency and knowledge base in our users at this point, because things like this, when you're starting to talk about these like larger data sets and especially if you're going into like Maryland's data portal and looking at all the information out there, I kind of expect a user going there looking for something to kind of know how to understand it. So, you know, there is that kind of assumption of if I present the information in a usable manner to you, you can make sense of it. Because A, there's only so much I can do, and then B, you wouldn't be here unless you were looking for this. I don't think, the average person is exactly going into the data portal to look up heat indexes of Annapolis. I don't know, maybe that is something you want to do, in which case I would still expect you to understand how to read this, and I just need to make sure that you have the tools to be able to do so. So in this case, that's why we have these methods of providing it both in a list or in a table, as well as the map, so that you have access to that information in a way that you can digest. Now, routing users, making sure our users are able to move around our application smoothly. Um, in some cases, it's kind of straightforward. In most setups, it's going to move through the standard operating way for your language. In our case, English, and that's going to be, top down, left, right. But we do want to give users options to move around quickly. In most cases, that's going to be things like headings or landmarks. Other cases, it might be better to give them a direct link. So something like a bypass link. Skip to content links are very common and should be a basic thing required by accessibility on most websites. In our case, we might want to give users a way to immediately get to the data or get to the controls or the search fields rather than let them move through everything to find it. So setting up a link at the start of your application that says skip to data or skip to controls would be really useful, because then I don't have to scroll through the entire map. I can just get to the data table instantly and do what I want there. So in the example on screen, we have a start here. So we've just loaded in our map and our portal. And the first thing I find when I press tab is skip to data link. If I press that, it takes me to the bottom of the page where there's the button to open the table will open, and I'm inside the table and I can move around that table, reading all that information if I'm looking for our office locations. Means that I don't have to scroll through the map. I don't have to figure out um, what all of those flags are in case they're not labeled properly, or they're all reading the same or whatever. It gives me a way to get to the information I want without having to do extra work. You also want to organize your reading order to put that accessible information first. So in most cases, when you load up a mapping application, in some cases with like a lot of the data portals, you might have the legend and the results on the left, or that's where you can, search for like a doctor's office to make an appointment, that kind of thing. So I want to get to that region first because that's the part A that I want to interact with, and then B, it's the more accessible part rather than the map itself. In other applications, I've seen it set up the other way, where the map is on the left and that region's on the right. And in those cases, if I have to move through the map first and there's, I didn't put in, within 25 miles of this address, so it's just showing me all of the ones in Maryland, all the doctor's offices in Maryland. There's thousands of those flags then. If I had to move through all of those to try and get to that point, I'm done. I'm leaving. I'm going to go use something else to get this. So that's why we want to make sure either you have a way to get to that field or those controls first with a skip link, or we just start you there. And if we start you there, then you can, work through those things. You might not even go to the map and use it because you can get what you need from the search results on the left or the right. We just moved you there first. And that's what we're talking about here is making sure that we give people a way that it's organized, that accessible information is right up front, or B, that it's in a way that makes sense. Um, a lot of the times with these pages or these web applications, you get a dialogue that pops up when you first get there, either detailing what it's showing you or telling you additional information about this, or in some cases, it's a disclaimer. And either result, if you are going to set up additional shortcuts or keyboard commands or other things, tell people that here. This is the best way to do it because A, your focus is already going to start here if it's set up correctly. So it'll read that dialogue. And then B, we make sure that people up front know there are additional commands you can use here that might be helpful. They don't have to go find those with like a help button or something. It's immediately available. You do still want that help button because you want people to be able to reference back. But telling people before they start doing anything, here are the commands to do so, we make sure that they have what they need immediately. And then finally, adding those extra buttons for all these tools. In some cases, again, you just have an extra link or a small button somewhere saying, jump to top. That's pretty common for, search results. And, especially when you start getting into, 20, 30, 40 results on a page, you want to be able to just jump back to the top and move, redo your search or something. Or in some cases, I'm in the bottom corner of the map and I want to get back to the search results. There might be a button there. It says, jump to search or something. Or I have keyboard shortcuts that let me do that. Control Alt S. I don't know, whatever you set it. But making sure that all of these tools are available at any time. The thing with maps is really we need to give options to users that help them, and then they can pick and choose what works best for them. We can't make it fully accessible for everyone at the same time. It's too complex a thing. So that's why we offer options instead. All right, so now we're going to get into the demonstration portion. I'm going to first go through Esri's uh, kind of explanation, and then I'll look quickly at Google Maps, and then we'll talk about some of the other parts here. So I'm just first going to make sure that this is working correctly. Yes, it looks like it is. So this is their demonstration of these accessibility components and principles. So there will still be kind of problems with this, and I'll highlight them and kind of explain what they should have done. But in most cases, it's because they're only showing this one thing. In this case, again, the high contrast base map. Now, I'm going to be just using keyboard controls for this whole thing, unless something goes horribly wrong, in which case I'll cheat and use the mouse. But for right now, I'm going to try and just use the keyboard. If you see that black outline, that bounding box around the working with enhanced contrast link, that is the visual focus indicator. This tells me where my keyboard is at the moment. If I press enter, it's going to click that link. If I press tab again, you kind of see this kind of light blue outline around choose symbol, color, and style. That means I'm there now. If I press enter, it'll open that. So I can do that and it opens. Didn't quite work because they separated out into slides instead. But that blue outline is much harder to see. So really what we should have done is had that black outline. But if I move back to the buttons here, I need to actually move my video feed out of the way. Give me just a moment. I apologize. There we go. But if I go here with Shift Tab and Tab, I'm now on these arrows in the top right. So those let me move from section to section. So now if I tab through all of these, I can get to the map itself. And now I can kind of control the map because the map itself is in focus. So my arrow keys now move the map. Pretty standard for most maps, which is good. But it does give us a way that a keyboard user can move up to look at, say, Santa Barbara without without a mouse, and so they don't have to try and move something that they maybe can't do physically, or in some cases, like if you just broke your wrist or something, you want to look up a doctor's office quick, you can do so with the keyboard instead of trying to awkwardly use the mouse with the other hand. The other thing here is that they give us other options. So we have this high contrast space map, or in the top right here, I have kind of inset look. Google Maps is something similar where there's other map options here. If I press enter, it switches it to this other type of high contrast map, color inverted. For some users with, say, diabetic retinopathy, this is a better option because they're usually wanting option or usually have things in an inverted color scheme. In other cases, maybe it doesn't work for them, but there is also dark mode. People like dark mode. I use dark mode all the time. In some cases, I might just want to use this because it's just more comfortable. So I have two options here to switch between, and a lot of map tools give you that ability to switch between several levels. You as a developer or organizer or manager, you really should offer this to users because in most cases it doesn't change anything that they're going to get from your app. It just gives them a better way to use it and work with it. So there really isn't a reason to take this away from users. Now, I should say I'm not using a screen reader right now. I'm just using keyboard access just for the sake of time. But all of this stuff would work with a screen reader as well. I've tested it. I've made sure these things are labeled. We can get this communications out. Um, Now, there is also this pop-up here, and this is where the keyboard shortcuts is. I would argue this should have been earlier, but since the primary purpose of this was really to show you the high contrast base maps, not the keyboard commands, I kind of get why it's not at the start, but it is something to keep in mind is now I can see, here's my shortcuts for, accessing the map or nudging it as we did. I can automatically put it north, I can rotate it, yada, yada. I can close that with escape. Pretty standard. So I have options for contrast, two different ones that might be better for different types of users. And there is also the possibility of another one. I can, depending on what software package you have from Esri, there's probably several other base maps available to you. And you can leave it up to the user to choose which one works for them. Now, in this case, this is about symbol color and style, what we were talking about with color contrast and such in the symbols. So, that you were using different texture patterns for, the gunnery range versus the Salton Sea there, but really it's, it's a it's a it's a lake. Um, but anything like that. But in this case, they're talking about the total population. This is the data that we're really trying to take away here. And so they've given us both color and symbols. So it's a bit harder to see. Now, if I believe if I just press, yep, if I just press plus, it zooms in. So this will make it a little bit easier to understand rather than, blown out and trying to tell the entire population density of, Long Beach, California, which I'm sure is incredibly high. But I can zoom in and like the LA, you have the large circle there over LA. I zoom in more and I move up there. We have all of these real large circles all there, but I also have it in purple. Um, but if I was colorblind, say, red, green, that purple might be a different color for me. Or if yellow, blue, I believe, yeah, I think yellow, blue. the yellow dots would look gray. So, making sure that we have that distinguishing color where there's still a good amount of contrast between these parts. Now, again, this is something where we're trying to show differences on a scale. So we have we don't really have a way to make this fully, colorblind accessible, and that's where symbols, sorry, is really necessary because now we have not just the color to communicate that information, but the larger circle, it should give me that information as well. In some cases, I might not be able to get, like east of LA, there's kind of those mid-sized circles kind of grouped up together, but there's a couple that are slightly different in color that are a little bit smaller. I might have to get real zoomed in order to be able to tell those differences. In those cases, I might want another way to get this information, but at the very least, there is a way for me to access it. So that's why don't just use color, don't just use, you know, one type. Communicate this in multiple ways, color and symbols together, textures, that kind of thing. But don't overdo it. Keep to one set of information or give people the ability to filter. And now, I had to do that. Get back. One of the tools that they have that I believe other tools have is this ability to emphasize or filters again. And in this case, they have a scroll bar just to kind of show it, but in most cases, it's a button that just changes it. But you can see how it makes things stand out a lot more in comparison. So again, if I zoom in, I have to like go back actually. So that's probably easier to tell. But uh, in this case, I have the scroll bar to help kind of add, shadow and outlines to everything and sharpen it to make it easier to see. So this works very well for enhancing that contrast, but it does add some extra detail. In most cases, they did it with a scroll bar so you can see the difference. Most cases, it's going to be a button press and it'll just make it like this. Um, I would recommend doing it that way because doing this kind of scroll thing, eh. I mean, it's kind of neat, but at the same time, I don't know how. I think that would be, again, a kind of mostly user preference. In most cases, you're probably going to want to make it simpler. But in either event, adding this emphasis and adding a way to either add it or remove it is very useful. Pop-ups. Um, Pop-ups are usually can be tricky. In this case, we have this floating one, but again, we have the ability to control it. We can open it, close it with these buttons. I can tell where I am because of that visual focus indication, both the blue outline and the darker spot. When it's highlighted, I can close it. Uh, I can zoom in. I can click that and it's going to throw me over there. This gives me a link to move it around. And then I can focus this part in order to control its scroll bar so I can go down and read, the rest of this information. In this case, they have, a pie chart, but they also have that data in the text above it. So visually, I have a way to understand this information, but there's also a way for someone non-visually to understand this information, or if they just want the numbers instead and the pie chart means nothing to them, especially because it's not labeled here. You know, I'm kind of assuming based on the numbers, that the larger orange part is the 1500 number, but you should have labeled that. And that's where we're talking about again, making sure things are connected. That maybe they should have put the 1500 over to the left and the 891 over to the right above the pie chart, so there's more of a visual connection between the parts. But again, with these pop-ups, that we have ways to control this. And if you noticed, when I moved here, I focused the whole map because usually we'll do that because the pop-up's technically in the map region, but it moved to the pop-up first. So I'm getting to what I want to deal with rather than trying to mess with like if there were search buttons or other buttons on here. Or if you notice, if I scroll all the way through, it starts going into like the Esri button there, um, that kind of thing. So I skip all that, getting to what I want. And then finally, providing alternative formats. And this is again where we're talking about things like tables and such because there's a lot of information presented here, but in some cases, someone's going to find it easier to parse in another manner. If you notice, when I clicked the next button, it started focus down here. You can think about that as that skip link that we talked about before, but I can say, show this, don't show this. So if I had other types of data here, I could filter them out. Then I can say, give me the table for this. And now I have the table of all that information, and I can just move through it with keyboard commands. I can move over with the arrow keys and say I want to filter by, ascending area of water, square footage, descending, that kind of thing. And then if I press tab again, now I can look through these things. I can select different parts and remove them or whatever, or I can move around and view them by this, look at the total population of this county. And the table, if it's coded correctly, which I know it is, when I'm in the cell, will tell me that heading and that row so that I know I'm in the right spot, or at least I know what that relationship between that data is. So all those are all the parts kind of demonstrated. As I said, this link is in the slide deck there for you to check out. Again, it is separated by these things. Now, something like Google Maps doesn't have all of these options. It doesn't have like a high contrast base map. Instead, it has like the satellite and the terrain and the transit views, biking views. So keep that in mind is that in some cases you're going to be using either like the Windows settings for color contrast or something else. But for at least directions purposes, they have done quite a bit of work though to make it accessible. Now, if I get to here, so one of the first things when I'm on the map is I can move by area or grid. Um, and the nice thing about this is that there's this list of like locations in here that I can immediately jump to an area like, Hartford or Heron Run Park or something. And now using the other commands that I know, like plus and minus resume, yada yada, I can try and zoom in further. So like say, there's Morgan State University. So our office is kind of close to there. Um, so I can zoom in there. So I can either now filter by Morgan Park or Morgan State University or another part of Morgan State University because I think the campus is separated or something. But, if I just want to go to, say, that Safeway there, I can get down there and zoom in, kind of zoom in more, Coco's Pub, there we go. So I can do things like that with just the keyboard. So if I'm just kind of exploring an area, there's a way for me to do that rather than try and guess using the search function or something. So they've done a lot of extra functionality there. Obviously, Google Maps has, the search functionality. The nice thing is that if I use that, and I type in, uh, Coco's Pub, you know, if I just start using arrow keys, it's going to move me there, but I can also say I want to get directions. I press that, it starts me over here. I don't have to move through other buttons as well. So, and then I can immediately close out of that by just one shift tab going back to close if I accidentally did that. So, you know, and then obviously there's all the different filters that I can use and change and such. So Google Maps has done quite a bit for keyboard functionality that also works with AT. So screen readers, they'll get all the same information that I've been reading off to you. Um, Voice commands work very well with this because you can tell it, uh, click transit and it'll click the transit button, things like that. So there's been a lot of work done here. Um, Now, for the sake of time, I do need to point out there are still a lot of challenges. There is still quite a bit of um, navigation that I have to do with the keyboard where I'm moving through multiple other elements. There's only so much we can do about that, but the smoother we can make that experience, the better. I do want to point out now, as a government employee, I cannot make recommendations and name names, but I can tell you that there has been done a lot on in the private sector to make more accessible maps out there. There's at least two companies I know of that I've seen presentations about that have made maps using sound as a way of explaining where you are in relation to something, or like when you get closer to a point, they will start providing descriptions. um, there's other companies as well that do accessible mapping that are specifically about going in, mapping your location, and then using an app to help provide explanations of spaces or how to get from point A to point B in a spot. So there are a lot of options out there available, both for just actual physical maps and using like your phone to navigate around, or for the purposes of putting a map on your website and letting your user move around it, say like a campus map for the university. They've set up ones that will describe where you are in relation to different points or what's in your immediate vicinity, that kind of thing. So that is pretty much everything. Final thoughts are just try and keep it simple. The more you add, the more work you have to do to try and make it more accessible to people. We do want to try to always offer alternatives or other tools so that users can get that information in a way that works best for them. Keep an eye on your color scheme and your choices just to make sure things are readable and easily understood. And then finally, whatever application you're using, check it with your keyboard because that's kind of your starting point. It might not solve all of your specific issues, especially if you start getting, really fancy with, keyboard commands and such. You're going to have to add additional functionality. But if you at least get keyboard working, it'll take care of the bulk of your basic problems for other AT. With that, if you would like to learn more or you want to discuss things with us, please feel free to reach out. As I said earlier, our email is mdod.nva@maryland.gov. You can visit our website, mdod.maryland.gov. Minnesota IT Services has done actually quite a bit about maps as well. I actually have shamelessly stole some of their material for this with their permission. But I learned a lot from them initially, so they are also a great resource. Esri has their own accessibility services. I just mentioned them because Maryland does a lot with their software, but there are others out there, and I'm sure they all have similar services, or they should. And same for Google Maps. If you are using a screen reader, I do want to say you should Google the help article about using Google Maps as a screen reader because there are some conflicts between their shortcuts and screen reader shortcuts, so you need to be aware of those. With that, are there any questions that I can address? I'll give it another minute, but it doesn't seem like it. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to our captioner today. As I said, this webinar is was recorded, so it will be up on our YouTube channel. This is something I work quite a bit with our state GIS office. So any of those of you working in that area or sphere and you want to discuss things, please reach out. Those of you who are state employees or with a state agency, you can reach out as well, and we can help with your maps and your works and how you can put them on online, what you might need to do to offer alternatives or make them more accessible. And for those of you outside the state, please still reach out. I'm happy to discuss with you. I just might not be able to offer more than a consultation at this time. Thank you, everyone. With that, I'm going to stop our recording.